Thanks, everyone. As Erhan mentioned, I just published a book called From the Other Side of the World, Extraordinary Entrepreneurs, Unlikely Places. And I would love it if you could actually pick up a copy. That's what I think all book authors do. But I want to talk about I profile 7 entrepreneurs from 7 different countries overcoming 7 different obstacles. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this book is that, and what I do is what I would like to talk to all of you about is my talk is going to be a little different. I know that a lot of the other speakers actually talked about you as an entrepreneur, what you need to do, and helpful suggestions. I'm actually going to make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to put entrepreneurship in context. I'm going to take it off the pedestal that it has been put on in society. I think we'll all agree that we hear about entrepreneurship so much around the world in our everyday lives, and people talk about being entrepreneurs, and they romanticize it. But the reality is that entrepreneurship really requires a lot. I think it requires far more than any other profession. You have to build supply chains, you have to think about customers, you have to think about building teams and talent. And so there's so many different moving particles about being an entrepreneur that is actually there's nothing romantic about it at all. And so I want to share with you 7 lessons that I learned traveling around the world. And the very first one is that entrepreneurship is not about technology. Ross just talked about a little while ago the fact that it's about an emotional experience. It's about connecting with people. And as I was traveling around the world, I saw a lot of people trying to create apps and a technology and either a self-driving car or a solar-powered telephone. And those are all really great, worthwhile endeavors. But when I really went and dug deep about what the original entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley did, they were actually focused on solving problems. Robert Noyce, who is one of the original members of the Traitorous 8 that set up Fairchild Communications and eventually created the very first microchip, and he went on to then co-found Intel. He actually said, I was trying to solve a production problem. I wasn't trying to create an integrated circuit. He had been working with DARPA and the Defense Department on how do you actually increase technology at the time, and that's what he was actually focused in on. And when I went around the world, that was the one common theme that I saw through the men and women, whether it was here in Turkey, where my book starts out, or in Nigeria, Mexico, India, Russia, and China, that people were focused on solving problems and not actually about focus on the technology, and they were using the technology as a means to actually solve that problem. Now, speaking of problem solving, my second lesson that I learned was that it has to be about focus. You want to solve a problem, but what I actually realized in going to Nigeria, where I had assumed that one of the biggest problems that the Nigerians had was poor infrastructure. I think you'll agree that bad roads, poor electricity, the lack of bridges, the ability not to be able to move around it hampers entrepreneurs from starting business and scaling them up. When I dug a little deeper, I actually realized that Nigeria's problem isn't actually poor infrastructure. It's the lack of financial infrastructure and the fact that you can't move money around. Even though Nigeria is Africa's richest country, it's Africa's most populous country, 80% of Nigerians do not have a bank account. Because they don't have bank accounts, there are no assets that are accumulated, and people are literally holding on to money. When you're holding on to money, it's not being leveraged. It's not being invested within the community and the society. And that's why Nigeria has poor infrastructure. So when you're actually looking at solving a problem, you really have to dig deep and really understand, why does that problem actually exist? Because if you're solving the wrong problem, your startup or your company is not going anywhere. So again, it really depends on your context. The third lesson that I learned in writing this book is that entrepreneurship is actually not about, I said it's not about technology, it's also not about techies. We constantly hear about the need to study STEM, science, engineering, technology, and mathematics. People should learn how to code and everybody should learn all of these things. I think that is absolutely important. I think that having great engineering talent and technology minds is critical in this day and age. Everything's on the internet, everything is now focused on technology. But when you're thinking about your startup, and when I looked at the men and women around the world, they were also thinking about talent. Because one of the things that has held up countries outside of the Western world from actually having globally competitive startups is the fact that they don't have skilled management, and they don't know how to build teams, and you don't have the right people in place. And so you can have the best engineers in the world, but if you don't have managers that can incentivize them, look at what their workflow is, if you don't have people who can go out and market and find you customers, if you don't have people who can go out there and tell your story. Ross talked about emotional experience. People want to connect with something, not just a product or a service. And so that was the third lesson I learned. My fourth lesson that I came away with in writing this book is that the myth of the entrepreneur in the garage, that's just not true. Entrepreneurship inherently is about community. Where there's a large concentration of people who are coming together and sharing ideas and exchanging, and then working on those ideas and iterating is where you have innovation. There's a reason that there's not a lot of innovation in say like the middle of the United States. And that you have entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of Silicon Valley and New York City and places like Lagos and Istanbul. There's a large concentration of people who are not only coming together, but they're sharing the best practices. We're here today at Startup Istanbul, where we're working together, we're exchanging ideas, and that's profoundly important. So where there's no opportunity to actually come together, collaborate, that is really one of the big impediments. So this myth that you have to be alone, it's not true. The fifth lesson that I learned in being an entrepreneur is, it's not just about your ideas, it's about what values do you have. So I'm just going to tell a little anecdote about one of the men that I profile in my book. Shafi Madar is the founder of a company in India called 1298. 1298 is a for-profit ambulance service. It originally came out of Mumbai. When I first heard about this, I thought, wow, I said, that's pretty odd. Why would number one, an individual citizen want to create a for-profit ambulance service? The reality is there were no functioning ambulances in Mumbai. When you called the emergency number, the ambulance would never come. Shafi found that out when he actually had a very scary incident with his mother. Shafi thought, you know what, in the 21st century, everybody talks about India being this economic powerhouse. We've joined the G20. We've become, this great country. We should have functioning public services. So he decided he was going to go out and he was going to create this ambulance company. It was only when he actually went to go register for a special telephone number, the emergency number that people could call to access his ambulance, did he realize what the true problem in India was. It wasn't that they lacked ambulances, it's that they lacked trust. Shafi went to the bureaucrat in the office in New Delhi, and the bureaucrat asked him for a bribe. He said, you need to pay me $4,000 to have this special number. And Shafi said, I will not pay you $4,000. And the bureaucrat said, great, I'm going to give you a crappy number. I'm going to give you the number 1298. Shafi, instead of taking that as a defeat, took that number and he told the story about what was plaguing India and why there weren't ambulances. He said, my values were that I wanted people to trust one another and that they could trust government services, and that I needed to tell people that our country wasn't able to offer these, not because we're not capable of providing them, but because of this horrible obstacle of corruption. And so he really stuck to his values, and his company not only has blossomed, 1298 exists in all of India's states. It's actually scaled out into Singapore and into Dubai, and he's actually looking to expand it into other places in Asia. The last 2 points that I want to talk about move away a little less from the individual entrepreneur, and it looks at kind of a more macro scale. And the sixth lesson that I learned is this concept of the status quo. And here is where I want to say to everyone who's here, particularly here in Turkey, which is an emerging market, but from all the other places, whether it's from Kenya or Pakistan or Europe, that you have an opportunity here because the status quo has to be one of the biggest obstacles to an entrepreneur. A couple of people have talked about Uber and Airbnb. They want to innovate on something where there's already existing businesses. The taxi and limousine services around, I know in New York City and around in different cities. The hotel lobby doesn't want Airbnb to take away any of their customers. And so what they do is they work with regulators and government officials to put roadblocks in their way. I actually see the status quo as being something that entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and in the West, holding them up from actually moving forward, and the opportunity to actually build something where there is nothing, where you can actually iterate on something and get it out there faster. That opportunity exists in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. There's a reason that financial technology, particularly mobile money, is coming out of Africa, and it is not coming out of Silicon Valley. There are no banks, there are no rules, and so people, whether it's in Kenya or in Nigeria, are actually able to then iterate and create that, and they're able to put that forward. So thinking about the status quo. My last point is about storytelling and the narrative. Writing this book was important to me for two reasons. I wanted to shift mindsets of two people. One, people in the United States, and particularly Silicon Valley, but then also for people here, whether it be in Turkey, or either in Mexico, or in Pakistan, or in India. When we say the word entrepreneurship in the United States, we automatically think of Steve Jobs. We think of Silicon Valley, we think Intel, we think Apple, we think Facebook. When you say the word entrepreneur in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or the Middle East, it has a different connotation. People either think you're corrupt. People think that you're doing something very micro, that you're making handcrafts, or you're just trading goods, that you're not actually innovating anything. I wanted to change the mindset by showing that entrepreneurship is all about creating communities. It's about focusing on people, and it's about actually going out there and leveling the obstacles that are there before you. And to really understand that Silicon Valley and the United States doesn't have a monopoly on innovation. Innovation exists anywhere where there is talent and there are people coming together willing to solve problems. The second mindset that I wanted to change was the people here. People here who question whether they can actually do it and grip with the self-doubt because that it was never done, that they can't do it. I'm telling you that you can, and that you need to be the pioneers in order to build the role models, but also help reset that narrative and that mind frame. Just because things were done in a certain way doesn't mean that they have to continue to be. You have to remember that entrepreneurship is always about destruction. It's about creating the new and making way for new opportunities to come up. And so to shift the mindsets, not only of people here, whether it be in Turkey or in Brazil or in Vietnam, but also for our own individuals. And I'll end on the note about women. You know, we don't see enough women in the technology sector, and we don't see enough women founders. We have to change that mindset of who is an entrepreneur and what they're capable of. Because as long as, and just to wrap up, entrepreneurship ultimately, it's about people, not products. It's about problem solving, not the technologies. And so I'll leave you with that, and just to let you know that the men and women that I met around the world, endlessly beautiful and just so inspiring. And so the next time that you think about, the conversation comes up about where the next Steve Jobs is going to come, my answer to that is the next Steve Jobs lives right here in Istanbul, or in Lahore, or in Lagos, or in Mexico City. Thank you.